Hey guys, today we're going to be going over muscle sensory receptors, namely your muscle spindles and your Golgi tendon organ. And what those are going to do is either stimulate a muscle or inhibit a muscle so that we either avoid damage or so that we can maintain lengths of muscle so we can protect our body in that way too. So to start out, we have the muscle spindle. And this will be excitatory. It's going to stimulate muscles or contract muscles and inhibit muscles such that your muscle length overall, you monitor muscle length through that stimulus. So a muscle spindle really is a receptor or a proprioceptor that monitors the muscle length. So when you're stretching a muscle, your muscle spindle is going to sense that and be like, are we stretching too far, or do we need to contract a little bit to keep us safe? So it senses that. These are intrafusal fibers. They're different from extrafusal fibers. Extrafusal fibers would be considered your regular muscle fibers. You're innervated by alpha motor neurons, so they don't exactly control the contraction of like what you're doing, but they're going to sense what kind of tension is placed on the muscle because of the force. And these are near tendinous insertions because that's where they're going to feel the stretch and be able to sense what kind of load you're putting on the muscle. So there are two types to muscle spindles, and those are bag fibers and chain fibers. Bag fibers are, well, they're clumped and bulging like a bag. And chain fibers are kind of strung out a little more linearly. And these are incorporated within the muscle. They sense what's going on. But there's key differences between bag fibers and chain fibers, mainly that bag fibers will have 1A innervation, which is, well, both types of fibers, bag fibers and chain fibers, have motor and sensory neurons. Let's focus on the sensory neurons first. Bag fibers are going to have 1A neurons, and those will be large and myelinated, and that's because they'll send very rapid impulses or very rapid action potentials through them at about 120 meters per second. Chain fibers will have type 2 neurons, and those will be smaller and myelinated. Well, both are myelinated, but type 2 fibers are smaller than 1A fibers, and because they're smaller, they'll send an action potential slower. So let's look at the difference between 1A and 2. In bag fibers, we have 1A, and what that's going to sense is the rate of the stretch. So if your muscle is stretching out, right, it's going to sense, oh, are we stretching too fast? Are we going to snap if we go too far? And then type 2 innervation done by your chain fibers is going to sense how long is our stretch in general, like how long are we stretching this muscle. So bag fibers have more to do with speed of the stretch, and chain fibers are more to do with how long are we stretching this muscle. Okay, moving on to the motor neurons for these bag fibers and chain fibers. They will be innervated, or they'll be innervated by gamma motor neuron groups, and these are on the ends of your bag units or bag fibers and chain fibers, and that's to maintain tension. So if you think about it, if you're contracting a muscle, it's shortening, and you're getting closer together, right? If your intrafusal fibers or your muscle spindle fibers are shortening, or they're shortening with the regular alpha motor neuron extrafusal fibers, then it's going to kind of sag if you don't do anything about it. So what these gamma motor neurons will do is they'll be stimulated such that the spindle fibers maintain tension on them so they can still have that sensory component to them. Because if they're relaxed completely, then they can't sense, oh, are we going to snap if we suddenly put too much tension or too much stretch on this muscle. And that happens in both bag fibers and chain fibers. It's really just to maintain the tension on the intrafusal fibers so they know what's going on and they can sense things. If they're too relaxed, they can't be aware of what's going on within the extrafusal fibers. Okay, so moving on, we have the Golgi tendon organ. This is inhibitory in contrast to the muscle spindle, which is excitatory, and it responds to tension. So with muscle spindles, we're responding to stretch, but with Golgi tendon organs, we're responding to tension. So stretch referring to the muscle, if the muscle is stretching. Golgi tendon organs responding to tension within the tendon itself. And the reason this is important is because your muscles are capable of pulling so hard on tendons that you can severely injure yourself if you pull too hard. Like you can have bone break and all these things if the muscles pull too hard. So Golgi tendon organ inhibits that so you don't break yourself. And this is found at the transition of muscle to tendon, so right on that end point between where your tendon starts and your muscle ends. Your motor neurons for your Golgi tendon organ are alpha motor neurons. And what they'll do is if they feel as if there's too much tension on a tendon, then they'll send a signal to your central nervous system, to your spinal cord, and it'll be like, hey, we're having too much tension, and then it'll interact with linear neurons and regular neurons, and it'll do the opposite. It'll inhibit the muscle that is under too much tension, and it will excite the muscle, the opposite muscle. So for instance, your hamstrings, say your hamstrings have too much tension on them, then the Golgi tendon organ is going to be like, hey, we can't do this. It's going to send a synapse to an interneuron. It's going to switch the signal and then be inhibitory at that point. So your hamstring is going to relax a little bit so you don't break yourself. But it's also going to synapse with a regular alpha motor neuron such that it stimulates your hamstring so that that'll contract and release tension on the hamstring. Just for an example, if you really want to dumb it down, the Golgi tendon organ is kind of like a circuit breaker. If you have too much power going through a circuit, it's going to shut things off and kind of protect the circuit. It uses interneurons to switch signals. So does the muscle spindle fiber, but so let's look at our two reflexes that we're going to discuss today. We have a stretch reflex and a withdrawal reflex. A stretch reflex is it's mechanically operated, so anytime a muscle feels some type of stretch, or a tendon or muscle feels some type of stretch on it, we'll have our stretch reflex. So if you're at the doctor's, right, and they get that rubber hammer or rubber mallet and they put it right there on your patellar tendon, you're gonna kick out, right? That's our stretch reflex in action. So what will happen is they'll hit your knee with the rubber mallet. You'll feel that stretch. It'll send a signal to a sensory neuron, sending an action potential to your central nervous system, and then it'll split to intraneurons and regular neurons. And you'll notice that we kick out. So what does that mean? That means we've sent an inhibitory signal to our hamstring for it to relax so that we can kick out. And then we've also sent an excitatory signal to our quad, so that we kick out as well. So we're exciting the hamstring and inhibiting we're exciting our quad and inhibiting our hamstring for that particular stretch reflex. So we go from sensory neurons to alpha motor unit neurons, so that we can contract or relax certain muscles depending on where the stimulus is of the stretch. And then we have our second type of reflex is withdrawal reflex, and this has to do with pain. So we'll have nociceptors on our body, like on our hands, and say you touch a hot stove, the instant reflex is to withdraw. So this can be called the flexor reflex too. You're going to flex away and get that hand out of the area of pain. So much like the stretch reflex, it feels that pain. There's send an action potential to the central nervous system. You'll synapse with neurons and inner neurons just switch the signal. So the neuron will stimulate your flexor muscles, so you flex your bicep to get your hand out of the way, and you'll relax your tricep such that you can move your arm out. And that's done by that switching of signal. So you inhibit your tricep but stimulate your bicep so that you get your hand out of the way. So yeah, that's the difference between a stretch reflex and a withdrawal reflex. I think the biggest difference is one is stimulated by pain or some type of harm, and a stretch reflex is stimulated by just a tension on a muscle or a tendon that will stimulate a motion or a reflex. So there you have our muscle sensory receptors between your muscle spindle fibers and your Golgi tendon organ, and how those two kind of work for our stretch reflex and our withdrawal reflex.